Hi, my name is Daniel Kamushi. I will talk to you about the growth hormone axis. This presentation will discuss the hypothalamus pituitary axis and specifically describe the growth hormone axis. Let's start with the anatomic relationship of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Think of the hypothalamus pituitary complex as the command center of the endocrine system, the system that regulates the hormones in our body. Hypothalamus is the control center for the endocrine system. This hypothalamus pituitary complex secretes several hormones that directly produce a response from the target tissues. Also, it secretes hormones that regulate the synthesis and secretion of hormones of other glands. The hypothalamus pituitary complex also coordinates messages between the endocrine and nervous system. What it means is that the stimulus that is received by the nervous system must first pass through the hypothalamus pituitary complex, then it is translated into hormones, and that will initiate a response. The hypothalamus pituitary complex is the one giving the orders. The hypothalamus, meaning sits below the thalamus, it is in the brain and located anterior and inferior to the thalamus. The hypothalamus has both neural and endocrine functions, producing and secreting many hormones. In addition, the hypothalamus is anatomically and functionally related to the pituitary gland, a bean-sized organ suspended from it by a stem called the infundibulum or pituitary stalk. It consists of two lobes that arise from distinct parts of the embryonic tissue. The posterior pituitary is neural tissue, whereas the anterior pituitary is glandular tissue. Each of these glands, anterior and posterior lobe, produce different hormones depending on the signal received from the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary lobe secretes growth hormones, GH, which promotes the growth of body tissues. This is the one that we are going to go into more detail in this presentation. It also produces other hormones, such as prolactin, that promotes milk production from mammary glands. Thyroid stimulating hormones, TSH, that stimulates thyroid hormone release from our thyroid. Adrenocorticotropin hormone, ACTH, which stimulates the hormone released by the adrenal cortex. Think of the kidney, for example. The anterior pituitary also secretes sex hormones, such as the follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, which is important for the stimulation of gamete production and gonads. Also, luteinizing hormone, LH, which stimulates androgen production by gonads. The second gland is the posterior pituitary gland, which secretes antidiuretic hormone, ADH, stimulates water reabsorption by the kidneys, as well as oxytocin that stimulates uterine contractions during childbirth. For the purpose of this presentation, we are only going to focus on the growth hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary hormones. The cells of the hypothalamus will receive inputs, either from either parts of the brain, or they can sense themselves the physiological conditions, like osmolarity of the spinal fluid. Once they get this input, and based on the input they receive, the glandular cells within the hypothalamus will then secrete specific hormones called releasing hormones. These releasing hormones will travel through capillary beds to the anterior pituitary gland. Once the releasing hormone reaches the target cells in the anterior pituitary, it will release a second hormone, dependent on the specific hormone from the hypothalamus. The second hormone will enter the bloodstream and can affect various target cells. In some cases, the target may be an additional endocrine structure, and that can lead to production of a final third hormone. Just so we make it clear, and from what I've said so far, a hypothalamus pituitary axis refers to the interactions between the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and any other endocrine organs. For example, the hypothalamus pituitary liver axis, which regulates growth, that I'm going to present in more detail here. But there are other hormonal axes that involve the hypothalamus and pituitary glands as well. A final important characteristic of an axis is that hormones released from the pituitary also can inhibit the hypothalamus. This means that they can stop the hypothalamus from producing more releasing hormones. And also, the hormones released from the endocrine gland can inhibit the pituitary gland, and the hypothalamus can also directly secrete inhibiting hormones based on the situation. It depends on the situation though. This is what we call the negative feedback mechanism. It is important as it helps keep our hormones in balance by preventing excess production by the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. I will now explain to you the hypothalamus, pituitary, and the liver axis regulates growth and the negative feedback mechanisms that help us regulate the growth hormones in our bodies. Just remember that the endocrine system regulates the growth of the human body. It also regulates the protein synthesis and cellular division. It's important for growth. A major hormone involved in this process is the growth hormone. Growth hormones is a protein hormone which is produced and secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. Remember, the primary function of this growth hormone is anabolic, which means it promotes protein synthesis and tissue building through direct and indirect mechanisms when it is using a third hormone called insulin growth factor, secreted by the liver. Basically, growth hormones act almost on every type of cell, and particularly targets the muscles and the bones. But remember, it has a direct metabolic effect on fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, and an indirect action that results in skeletal growth. Direct metabolic functions know that GH is anabolic, meaning it stimulates the growth of almost all tissues of the body that have the capacity of growing or increasing their cell numbers. How is it going to increase the growth? Well, GH increases the rate of protein synthesis. It also increases the glycogen breakdown and helps increase the glucose in our circulation. It mobilizes the stored fat from the fatty tissue and increases the free fatty acid level in the blood for energy. Indirect action on skeletal growth means that the GH will stimulate the production of a third hormone in the liver called insulin-like growth factors from hepatocytes. So the growth hormone will push the liver to produce IGF-1. Growth hormones when also have a synergetic effect on IGF-1. It is the IGF-1 that exerts direct action on both cartilage and bone to stimulate growth and differentiation. These effects are critical for growth during childhood, all the way to the end of adolescence. GH levels are controlled by the release of growth hormone, releasing hormone, GHRH, and growth hormone inhibiting hormone, GHIH, from the hypothalamus. Now that I talked to you about the direct and indirect effects and what stimulates or inhibits the growth hormone, I'm going to explain these effects step by step, starting from the hypothalamus. There will be repetition, but it's important to know these steps. At first, the hypothalamus releases the growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH, which stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to produce growth hormone. Then, the anterior pituitary gland which produces the growth hormone, which has wide-ranging effects on the body. One effect is that GH stimulates the breakdown of adipose tissue, releasing fatty acids into the blood and helping to fuel the increased metabolism occurring in other tissues. GH also directly stimulates growth in various tissue types, particularly skeletal muscle and bone. GH binds to receptors on target cells like skeletal muscle cells, osteoblasts, and chondrocytes, and increases cell division. GH then stimulates the liver to break down glycogen, the storage polymer of glucose, to glucose, which is then released into the blood. This provides an additional energy source for increased metabolism. The next step, GH binds to receptors on liver cells, an endocrine gland, and triggers the production of hormones called insulin-like growth factors, IGFs. The IGFs work together synergistically with GH to enhance cellular division and growth. IGFs stimulate cells to increase their uptake of amino acids from the blood for protein synthesis. Skeletal muscle, osteocytes, and chondrocyte cells are particularly sensitive to stimulation from IGFs like IGF-1. Finally, as IGF-1 levels increase, some of the hormone circulates in the blood and returns to the hypothalamus. The high concentration is detected by the cells of the hypothalamus and results in the production and release of growth hormone inhibiting hormone, GHIH. The effect of GHIH is to stop the production of growth hormones. This is a form of negative feedback and prevents GH and IGF-1 levels from rising too high in the body. This is important for hormone regulation. Finally, I will discuss some dysfunctions that can arise from this endocrine system. Dysfunction of the endocrine system's control of growth can result in several disorders. For example, gigantism, which is a disorder in children that is caused by the secretion of abnormally large amounts of GH resulting in excessive growth. A similar condition in adults is acromegaly, which is a disorder that results in the growth of bones in the face, hands, and feet in response to excessive levels of GH in individuals who have stopped growing. We discussed this topic about acromegaly in last week's application assignment. Another problem that people with acromegaly can have is because they have high levels of GH. It can also cause diabetes and glucose intolerance. As I said earlier, one of the direct effects of these growth hormones is to stimulate the liver's breakdown of glycogen and to turn into glucose and release it into the blood circulation, which leads to high blood sugar level and diabetes. Remember, excess of GH after epiphyseal closure causes acromegaly, whereas gigantism results from GH hypersecretion before epiphyseal closure. Abnormally low levels of GH in children can cause growth impairment, a disorder called pituitary dwarfism, also known as a growth hormone deficiency. Thank you for listening, and here are my references.